All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to take our measurement unit and we're ready to move on to the next lesson. We've already talked about time and we've talked about linear measurement, and now it's time to talk about area. The first thing we need to talk about is what is area, because a lot of people have a misconception as to what area is all about. There's a lot of people who think that area is the inside of an object, and that's absolutely not true. I ask a lot of people, what is area? And they give me the answer, it's the inside of an object, and that's not what area is. So I want to make sure before we do anything that we really understand what area means. And the definition that we are going to use in here, and the definition that I will be expecting to get from you when it comes to test time, is this one right here. Area is a measure of the number of squares of a given size that are required to cover a two-dimensional object. So for example, if I have a two-dimensional object, and I'll pick a nice simple one like a rectangle, what I'm interested in is how many squares does it take to cover the inside of the object? Area has something to do with the inside of the object. But what I'm interested in is how many squares does it take for me to cover up that two-dimensional object? In order to do that, what we have to do is we have to look at a grid. Okay? So over here, we've got a grid that we're going to bring out here. And what we can do is if we overlay the grid over the top of the object like this, we can start to count and figure out how many squares does it take to cover the object up. So if I go through and I look at it like this, I can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 squares. And just to make life a little bit simpler, let's do this. Let's make this guy just a little bit smaller, so that when we put it on there, it's exactly 10 squares. We don't have any partial squares. And then if I go down the line, so I've got 10 squares, and then I've got 10 more down this row right here, right? So if I look at it this way, I've got 10 rows of squares. And then if I go across the top, I can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oop, that's not very square, is it? Doesn't look square, at least. I've got 10 columns of squares. So if I were to count this all up, I could see that altogether it takes a total of 100 squares to cover this object. So we say that the area of this object is 100 squares. Okay? Area is the number of squares it takes to cover an object. That's the definition that we're going to be working with. Now, one of the things that we have to be careful of is the size of the square matters. Take a look at this rectangle right here. If I take this rectangle and I put it on this grid right here, and I start to count the number of squares, it's pretty simple. Don't have to do a lot of counting. There's 4 rows and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. So the area, if I look at this, looks to be 20 squares. The area of that object is 20 squares based upon this grid. But if I take this same rectangle and I move it down here and I put it on this one, obviously it's going to take a lot more than 20 squares to cover that rectangle. So the size of the square makes a really big difference, and that's why it's really important that we tell people as we're measuring what size squares we're going to use. Okay, we don't just want to say the area is equal to 20 or the area is equal to 100. We need to be more specific than that. Now, if we go a little bit further, let's take a look at this ruler right here. If I were to draw a line that goes from right here to right here, that line represents 1 inch. That line is 1 inch long, at least based on this ruler that I have right here. All right. If we want to talk about area, though, we can't measure area using lines. It doesn't make sense to try to cover something up with a line like this. You can't cover something with a line. That's why we need to use squares. So if I take this square, and I hope I can draw a good perfect square with this. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to real well. Okay, let's try it this way. If I draw my line segment across like this, so that it's 1 inch wide, and then I take my ruler, I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to rotate it around so it goes straight up and down, if I can figure that out, like this. And then I measure off another inch right here, like this. That represents 1 square inch after I clone it and group it, and maybe it's not going to be just as good as the other one I had, probably, the way it looks. But if I put this together, that square right there would represent 1 square inch. Now, we usually don't represent 1 square inch by writing out the word square, and I'm sure you've seen this before. This is not anything that's completely new to you, okay? We normally would represent 1 square inch by doing the following. We'd say 1, we'd say 1 with the inch symbol, and then we'd put the 2 raised to a power. That represents 1 inch squared. That's a big difference than if we go up here with this line up here. This line represents 1 inch. There's a big difference between an inch and a square inch. An inch can be measured, can measure things that go in straight lines. A square inch represents how much it takes to cover something up. Okay, and that's a big difference between if you were to do the same thing, for example, and make a square centimeter. A square centimeter is going to be smaller than a square inch. A square centimeter might only be that big compared to a square inch. All right, and so we have to be really, really careful when we tell people how we measure area. There's 2 really, really important things you have to remember. You have to put this down right here because that tells people what the size of the square is. It's saying, hey, we're measuring using inch squares. And that little symbol up here is important because it tells people that we're measuring squares and not straight lines. Notice up here, this doesn't have an exponent on it. That's a straight line measurement. There's a big difference between linear measurements and area measurements. So that's just a little brief introduction. It's maybe you probably heard it all before. All right, you probably heard all that stuff before, but maybe not in the same way. I really want you to focus on this definition because I'm going to make a big deal out of it every time I talk to you about area. Okay, so we're going to stop now, and what you're going to do is you're going to complete the first area assignment. You're going to be able to find that. I'll tell you where you can find that assignment, and you need to complete that assignment before you go on.